Perfect.
All right. Hi, I'm John. My pronouns are he/him, and I'd like to thank you for attending our Misogyny and Disability event. So we'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Pigunni, the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. We would also like to note that the University of Calgary is situated on land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and that the traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mohkinstsis, which we now call the City of Calgary. So as we usually do at IDEA, we are recording this event and putting it on our website at idea.ca. That's IDEA with 2 A's, so IDEAA.ca. If anyone isn't okay with that for whatever reason, then you can private message me on Zoom or email me at john.hutchinson@ucalgary.ca. And we can, make sure you're edited out, or we can stop recording, whatever you need. And I'd like to pass it off to Cayley, who is the speaker for this event.
Perfect. So hello, everybody. Thanks so much for coming to my talk on intersectionality as it applies to the unique double discrimination faced by women with disabilities. I'm Cayley Hodgson, my pronouns are she, they, and I am the research coordinator with the Invisible Disability Education and Advocacy Association. I just want to lay out a broad agenda for some of my talking points this evening before we begin. First, I want to make sure that we're on the same page of the definitions I'll be using for some of the key terminology. And then I don't know how to get rid of that. There we go. And then I'll go over some items in medical history that I feel encapsulate a lot of the issues that women with disabilities face. After that, I'll talk a bit about the diagnostic process and how that impacts disabled women. And then I'll talk on some action items. And I do want to put out a bit of a content warning for parts of my presentation. I'll be talking about uncomfortable and possibly triggering things such as reproductive control, eugenics, medical experimentation, abuse, and similar topics. If you get uncomfortable and you need to take a moment or exit the presentation, then please make sure to prioritize your own well-being. And don't forget about great resources like the U of C Wellness Center or the Distress Center Crisis Hotline. The Women's Resource Center does also offer peer support. So the first key term I'm going to be defining here is the word woman itself. As a queer person, I know that gender is a very nebulous kind of social construct. So please understand that when I say women, like as a concept, I'm often referring to the struggles faced by women of all kinds, not just cisgender women. However, many of the medical struggles I'll be touching on specifically apply to people who are assigned female at birth, so specifically people with uteruses. A lot of the literature on disability and impairment focuses more so on biological sex than it does on gender. So unfortunately, much of what I know focuses more on sex and gender as well. Additionally, being queer complicates a lot of a person's gender experience, and the concept of queerness and disability interacting isn't something that's really had a lot of academic study. So unfortunately, I don't have much to say on that that's been backed up scientifically so far, though I do have some thoughts of my own on the matter. The term disability is also fairly broad. In this presentation, I'll be using disability as an umbrella term to refer to the unique social and medical barriers faced by disabled people. Impairment, by contrast, focuses on the physiological differences that a person has that may inhibit their ability to carry out certain tasks. You may have noticed that so far I've said disabled people instead of people with disabilities. This is a very conscious choice on my part. Person first is language is like saying person with autism as opposed to autistic person, which would be identity first. These two ways of referring to disabled people have a long and fraught history. Person first language was intended to center the individual person instead of their disability, but many disabled people do argue that they shouldn't need to deprioritize their identity as a disabled person to receive equal treatment, that it's the job of able people to understand the inherent humanity of disabled people beyond their diagnosis. I will personally be using identity first language the majority of the time. Since many disabled communities prefer identity first language, it's always best to ask. The social and medical models of disability are also extremely important concepts to keep in mind when thinking about disability. The social model refers to a disability as a societal barrier a person faces due to their non-normative body, whereas the medical model conceptualizes disability as an individual's own impairments. I also want to touch on a few other terms that may not come up as much, but I think are still of value to the conversation surrounding disability. Prevalence and incidence are very similar sounding words, but they mean entirely different things. Prevalence refers to how many people have a certain diagnosis at a certain point as a measure of a proportion of the population, whereas incidence describes how many new cases of this diagnosis were found in a certain time period. So, for example, in Alberta here, we have a daily briefing of new COVID cases in a 24-hour period. This would describe incidence and not prevalence. Comorbidity and multimorbidity also sound very similar until you break the words down a bit. Comorbidity describes other conditions that occur as a result of a primary kind of initial condition, but multimorbidity is a series of conditions that aren't related to any primary condition. The morbidity paradox is something that I think is very interesting and it relates very well to the topic today. In layman's terms, it's kind of the idea that women are sicker, but men die quicker. This paradox refers to the idea that women tend to have more chronic conditions than men, whereas men tend to have conditions that are fatal. Additionally, women have a longer lifespan than men, so they also tend to outlive them regardless of any conditions. The compression of morbidity also relates to the idea that as medical technology improves, people aren't seeing the onset of age-related disability until much closer to their deaths. However, this often means that there's more disability squeezed into those last few years because a certain amount of age-related impairment is unavoidable as far as we know as mere mortals. I do find this interesting because women tend to live longer than men on average, so more women are having to deal with this compression of morbidity. Now, on to medical history. I think it's so important that people know where their prejudice ideas come from, and a lot of the misunderstandings surrounding women's health actually come from witch hysteria. The fear of witches is a cultural fixture at this point, which is interesting for a number of reasons. Witches were mentioned in the Bible and Saul's story, as well as at several points in Greek and Roman mythology, most notably with Circe, but the hysteria really kicked up another notch with the advent of the Malleus Maleficarum. This book was released in 1486 and was written by Heinricus Institoris, a deeply religious man with a firm mistrust of anything supernatural. The Malleus featured a papal bull, which is essentially a letter from the Pope at the time, and it stated that the church agreed with the Malleus. With the advent of the Malleus and the endorsement of it by the church, the witch craze truly begun. Many of the women targeted were midwives and herbal healers, and not actual Satanists. Witch panic continued well into the 18th and 19th centuries, though one of the examples of the witch craze in North America that many people may be familiar with is the Salem witch trials of 1692. Some people argue that these were just an extension of the witch issues in Europe, but the roots were entirely different. While the European witch craze was rooted in misogyny and the idea of ownership around female bodies, there were more psychological factors at play in Salem. Many of the young women hanged for witchcraft were experiencing hallucinations and other episodes of psychosis brought on by very harsh conditions and a fungal infection in their grain supply. The othering and killing of countless women in the witch trials marked the destruction of countless centuries of oral knowledge about medicine and the female body. Even in the Malleus Maleficarum, Heinricus Institoris mentions many of the herbs that women use in their rituals, which are well recorded in modern witchcraft and natural healing to have antiseptic properties, such as sage. There's also a distinct lack of male knowledge of female health, as well as of female healers. So hysteria is a word that used to refer to a condition described in ancient Greeks as a wandering uterus. The word hysteria literally means condition of the uterus if you break it down into the Greek and Latin roots. So as time went on, male doctors and scientists realized that organs don't just go wandering around the body, but then hysteria was the term that they applied to women who they deemed to be uncontrollable or quote unquote crazy. Many of the symptoms of hysteria are behavioral and physiological things that happen during the female hormonal cycle or when your gender has been oppressed by patriarchal structures of domination for centuries. It used to be treated by a pelvic exam of sorts, where a doctor calls it a paroxysm of the uterus. We now know of this as a female orgasm, and this treatment was used before resorting to, a hysterectomy or an institutionalization. Hysteria was eventually used as a catch-all diagnosis for women who were having any kind of difficulty, and it was used to minimize the physiological and psychological pain of women. The area of research and development has its own set of painful baggage for women's health. So much medical research is done only on men, including clinical trials for many medications. This is partially why the diagnostic criteria for some conditions is so skewed towards the male experience. For example, including the symptoms of heart attacks. If you were assigned female at birth, please Google the symptoms for a heart attack for a person of your biological sex. You will have different symptoms. This could save your life. Additionally, this lack of research on women's health problems causes severe underdiagnosis on disabling conditions like endometriosis and autism. Much of the research that has been done on women has also been in extremely unethical situations. The self-proclaimed father of gynecology, J. Marion Sims, did most of his experimentation on slave women to the point of torturing innocent Black women simply for the sake of curiosity before then sterilizing them. Also, medical students at some institutions learn how to do pelvic exams on female patients while they're under anesthesia, which gives these women no chance to consent. In the current day, things are getting better, but we're not there yet. Women with disabilities face far more violence than non-disabled women or men of any ability level. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities discusses gender-based violence that disabled women face, and it outlines specific policy measures that ratifying nations should take to prevent such heinous maltreatment. Disabled women also face higher rates of unemployment than men and able-bodied women, which is an example of the devaluation of both women and disabled people as players in the capitalist workforce. I do want to talk a bit on eugenics in institutions, since it's very important to the history of disabled women. Much of medical misogyny is expressed through reproductive control of women, and eugenics is no exception for this. The concept of eugenics took the idea of deviations from the norm, and then it pathologized it, forming a so scientific notion of what the ideal human should be. I don't like that word should. It doesn't apply to people. So this means that any disabled people, many women, and many Black and Indigenous and people of color were incriminated for being non-normative or of lesser value than an able-bodied white man. Countless people were sterilized or killed because they were considered to be bad for the gene pool, and Alberta was no exception. Institutions are one of the avenues in which eugenic control has been exerted over disabled people, but disabled women in particular. So the picture that I've attached here is a picture of the Missioner Center that used to be just up in Red Deer, where the majority of the work of the Sexual Sterilization Act of 1928 was carried out. Conditions in here were appalling. There was a news expose of the Missioner that detailed all of the mistreatment of the disabled people institutionalized here. Many people faced medical experimentation, appallingly strict rules about hygiene and behavior. Some people even went without clothes and food as punishment for behaviors they couldn't control. A lot of the people who were institutionalized at the Missioner also said that the bathroom was a row of toilets against the wall with one chain by the door that the nurse could use to flush all of the toilets, and you all had to go at the exact same time. It was just horrific. Thousands of women in particular were surgically sterilized without their consent. Many of these women were told that they had appendicitis, but others weren't told anything at all. Issues arose when abusive parents had their children deemed quote-unquote mental defectives and dropped them off at these institutions, which happened much more commonly than you'd hope. A woman named Leilani Muir came forward as an adult and exposed the true extent of the eugenics that had happened at the Missioner Center. She only found out that she had been sterilized when she was having troubles getting pregnant. This eugenic sterilization of disabled women continued until allegedly 1972, but there are still measures in place that force reproductive control on disabled women. In the 1900s, there was quite a moral panic about bad genes circulating in the gene pool. When a person thinks of eugenics and taking out a population of undesirable people, one may think of the Second World War and the Nazi extermination of the Jewish people. But what many people are pretty unaware of is that disabled people were the first people targeted in Nazi extermination plans. And beyond just Nazi Germany, eugenics as a concept has been kicking around since the early 20th century, and many of the tactics used to subjugate undesirable populations in Nazi Germany were borrowed from American and Canadian eugenic policies and then just taken to the extreme. Residential schools are another example of eugenic control of women. I won't go too much into it since I'm neither Indigenous nor an expert, but many of the things that happen in institutions happen in residential schools as well. Indigenous people were brutalized and abused because they were considered to be inferior and non-normative, and the effects of the systemic abuse is still so prevalent. The last residential school only closed in 1996. The idea of eugenics really emphasizes how important the words you use truly are. Earlier, I mentioned that abusive parents could have their willful daughter labeled as mentally defective so that they could do whatever they pleased to her medically without her consent. Even today, you hear so much discourse around slurs and different words and who gets to use them and who doesn't, and it really just comes down to history and respect. When in doubt, please ask. Diagnosis for disabled women, it's a whole other ballgame. Our whole world is governed by social norms based on ascribed and achieved identities. Ascribed identities are ones that you're born with, such as some impairments, sex, ethnicity, and culture, whereas achieved identities are things that you develop over time. Assigned gender at birth based on sex is such a huge determining factor for the way people see the world, and how the world sees them, and it can have a massive impact on how you're treated in a medical avenue. The diagnostic criteria for autism, for example, are based around how autism presents in young white cisgender boys who come from affluent families, which leaves out so many people, so many people. Autism can present differently based on how a person has been socialized to act, which leads to women being chronically underdiagnosed for autism. Additionally, much of the research on other disorders and medications is done on men, particularly white men who have the time and the means to partake in research studies. One of the rallying cries of the disability rights movement has been nothing about us without us. And this remains particularly true for medical research and the development of medications and treatments. So much of disability is grounded in a person's medical experiences, and it's important to recognize that impairment is a large part of the disabled experience, regardless of any of the social implications. A lot of the social implications do also take place inside of the actual medical care settings. This comes back to the idea of hysteria a lot of the time. And since medical education was inaccessible to women for a very long time, after they burned all the midwives, much of the medical knowledge doctors receive aren't based on women's teaching or women's bodies. Ask any woman and she can probably tell you about at least one time she experienced medical maltreatment due to her gender. Ask any disabled, queer, or trans woman about medical maltreatment, and she'll just laugh and ask which time. Additionally, diagnosis is a privilege. Not everybody has the time, the money, the emotional or physical energy, or the support systems to pursue a medical diagnosis. So often people are left without support because they're unable to get an on-paper diagnosis. It's a bit easier in Canada than it is in America since we have universal healthcare, allegedly, but not everything is covered, and it often takes a long time and a lot of frustrating tests to get any sort of diagnosis. That's even before you consider the inherent ableism in our current curative primary care model of medicine that we see in Alberta, plus all of the bad experiences that people have with medical professionals. Just to use a personal example, I was having some issues with some hip and some back pain, and I wanted answers and a plan to try and move forward. So I saw a specialist, as you'd think is the right thing to do. He ignored half of what I said. He didn't even check my hip, left me alone in the exam room for more than half of the appointment. And then, he told me I had anxiety, which wasn't news, and it didn't account for any of my physical pain. Of course, that's not to say that many women's mental health doesn't have an impact on their physical health. There's a very complex and emerging body of work on the relationship between a person's mental health and their physical health. Mental illness can be just as disabling as physical impairment, so it's crucial to understand mental illness just as well. Depression is twice as common in women as it is in men, and disabled women are a further 13 times more likely to have depression than non-disabled women. There are also differences in how women experience mental illnesses compared to men, especially in the areas of symptom onset, symptom frequency, the course of the overall disorder, and their social adjustment. Women are also more likely to be misdiagnosed with mental illnesses than men are. So I want to take ADHD and autism as an example of how hard it is for disabled women to even get diagnosed, let alone the othering experiences they have due to their unique struggles as disabled women. Women are so severely underdiagnosed with these neurodivergencies, and they're more likely to be diagnosed with several other unrelated things instead of the proper term, because some people do actually believe that women can't be autistic or can't have ADHD. There's also a really big racial imbalances in how ADHD and autism are diagnosed. since these are primarily social disorders and social norms are different in different subcultures, but I'll come back to that. ADHD and autism are both comorbid with many disorders. With ADHD, you see things such as impulse control and personality disorders, anxiety disorders, sleep disorders, learning disabilities, substance use disorders, mood disorders, body-focused repetitive behaviors such as trichotillomania and dermatillomania, as well as eating disorders. Autism is comorbid with things such as anxiety, sleep disorders, epilepsy, gastrointestinal issues, other developmental disabilities, and obsessive compulsive disorders. So for a little bit of audience participation here, I want to list the symptoms of ADHD here and see if you notice anything interesting about them. So some of the visible symptoms of ADHD are inattention, fidgeting, short-term memory problems, and hyperfocusing. And for those of you who aren't 100% sure what hyperfocus is, it's when somebody with ADHD gets locked into a task and is unable to divert their attention to anything else, even to recognize they need to eat or to use the washroom. People with ADHD also experience impulsivity. They have difficulties remembering normal routines, have difficulties with transition time, issues with executive functioning, time blindness, and mood swings. Now, what'd you notice? Feel free to turn your mic on or type it into the chat. John, if you could keep an eye on the chat, that'd be great. I'll give you a minute or two here. If you don't feel like contributing anything, that's totally fine.
Sydney says lots of internal symptoms you can't see.
Yeah, so that's definitely part of it. What I was really getting at here is that all of those symptoms are ways in which people with ADHD inconvenience neurotypicals and not the ways in which they're personally impacted by their own neurodivergence. So this just goes to show that historically, neurotypicals haven't cared one whit about neurodivergent people and how they experience their world, only their own comfort. Ableist, right? That's pretty bad. So what other social norms do these symptoms contravene? Well, women are, supposed to be quiet, subservient, deferent to male voices and male authority and in the background. Young girls with ADHD are pushed more and more into kind of masking their symptoms than boys are, since it's more normatively acceptable for boys to be loud and on the move and dynamic. Because of these gender norms, the current conception of ADHD is noticed more often in boys. Additionally, ADHD was previously thought of as a disorder of childhood that people grew out of, but we know better now. But this new knowledge of ADHD hasn't really passed into popular consciousness, and more adult women are finding themselves without support. Women also tend to be diagnosed much later in life than men when it comes to both ADHD and autism, with women getting diagnosed more in their 20s and 30s, and men often receiving diagnosis in childhood. So what does this say about how we treat young people of either sex? What does this say about what we do to young disabled women? Additionally, women with ADHD are more likely to feel like social outcasts in their childhood, resulting in trauma and rejection-sensitive dysphoria. Women with ADHD are made to feel broken for no real reason, whereas men with ADHD often receive more support throughout their lifetimes. Women are also sanctioned more often for the symptoms of their ADHD than men are. So the image on the right here is one I found on social media a long time ago that I felt really described what it's like to have ADHD. I want to kind of emphasize the ideas of trouble regulating emotions and choice paralysis, which if I can just find it is at the bottom here. And since those things are such an integral part of the ADHD experience, but they're often ascribed to gender differences and therefore minimized. So I want to turn now to some items for action. It's so important to support disabled women in the workplace. Disabled women are more likely to be employed in part-time and low-skill jobs, and they earn much less than non-disabled women. In a study done in 2014, women with disabilities working full-time were paid just 67.5% of what non-disabled men were paid, and just 82.5% of what disabled men were paid. Accommodations are mandatory to provide under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and under Canadian law. And not only will accommodations help the disabled women in question, but they often make things easier for every single employee. People are able to achieve such a high quality professional life if they're just given opportunities to succeed. So recognize your colleagues, stand up when you see injustices, get involved in unions and in activist spaces. And women with disabilities are, as you may recall, 13 times more likely to have depression than non-disabled women. A large portion of the disabled experience is social isolation. So make sure you reach out to your friends, since they may not know they can reach out to you, or they may have trouble initiating conversations. Make friends outside of your typical social group. Make an effort to unlearn your internalized prejudices about disabled people. Ask what you can do to help instead of just assuming that they need help. If your friend is struggling, offer specific help instead of just asking if you can help. So, for example, if your friend has been struggling with care tasks, offer to help with their dishes or to tidy up the living space. Disabled women do so much emotional labor to try and educate people about what it's like to be both disabled and a woman. It's incredibly hard talking about the discrimination that you face on a daily basis. So try to take some of that labor off their shoulders and educate yourself. Find people on social media that discuss ableism and misogyny. Look things up, watch TED Talks. Love TED Talks, great way to get information. Most important of all, get involved. Do some of the work yourself. The most important thing to remember is the rallying cry of nothing about us without us. So don't speak for disabled women, uplift their voices instead. Learn about ways you can help in the community, fundraise for activist spaces, use your position of privilege for good. Above all else, nobody is equal until everybody is. So it's critical to try and build a world where everybody has the same access to opportunities. And nothing about us without us is the rallying cry we all need to remember above all else. So thank you so much for coming to listen to my talk tonight. If you have any more questions, you're more than welcome to ask. Otherwise, please email me at ideaUcalgary@gmail.com. I'd be happy to be in touch. We do also have a website listed here and an Instagram account. I will just leave my references up here if anyone's interested. A lot of my knowledge is taken from my ongoing degree in community rehabilitation disability studies, as well as personal experience. So if you have questions, go for it. I'll do my best to answer them.